this hour, has Hong Kong reached a tipping point? China's tolerance seems to be running out after airport protests turned violent. And rapper A$AP Rocky is found guilty of assault. We're live in Stockholm with the sentencing details. Plus, an elusive military force operating in Africa backed by members of the Russian government. We have a CNN exclusive report. All that and much more right here at the International Desk. Welcome, I'm Lynda Kinkade. Good to have you with us. Well, a sense of calm has returned to Asia's third busiest airport, but about 1,000 flights were affected by those protests this week. The airport authority has obtained an injunction to block protests and keep people from obstructing operations. For 2 nights, protesters overran airport security and used luggage carts to barricade security checkpoints. The majority of those demonstrators have now gone home. Beijing is condemning an incident in which a group of protesters turned on a man they suspected of being a Chinese agent. Well, he was later identified as a journalist from the Chinese state news outlet, the Global Times. China says the attack challenges press freedom. Well, let's bring in Paula Hancocks. She joins us now from the international airport there in Hong Kong. Paula, after 5 days of protest, 2 of which shut down the airport, how are things looking now?
Well, Lynda, it seems like a completely different airport today. The departures are going ahead. The people are coming in as normal. Clearly, there are some delays catching up over the past couple of days. But now there is a very small pocket of protesters that remain, maybe a couple of dozen, and they're peaceful. They're sitting down. What we can tell you is the reason for that, for the start, is that there is more security now. They have checkpoints, or at least earlier, at the doors, at the entrances, to make sure that people have passports and boarding passes, and they are in fact passengers as opposed to protesters trying to come in en masse. There is a smaller protest elsewhere in the city, so it's not that this is over. It's just it's moved away from the airport at this point. But the fact is that passengers have been inconvenienced. I spoke to a couple who actually found themselves, as they arrived on Monday night, in the middle of the protests.
I thought it could erupt into anything, at any moment. I thought there might be tear gas and bullets fired, and, it was, really frightening.
We were first here 22 years ago, and it was a wonderful place, but we certainly won't be coming back. It's an experience I'll never forget. Yeah, never. Particularly when they said, look, if they start shooting, fall down on the ground. Just go straight down.
When I saw a lot of people screaming and yelling, and then one lady's, I think the police, they hit or shooting with the gun or something, smashed on her eye, and she got one eye blind.
Does this change your opinion of Hong Kong?
Yes. Change everything now.
So this, of course, is a concern for Hong Kong, that those passengers inconvenienced. Now, many of them that I've spoken to say that they have no intention of coming back here. It is damaging the reputation of the city. Lynda?
Kind of an incredible sort of surreal moment for those passengers there in Hong Kong, completely unexpected. But give us a sense of what this means for protesters. If they're banned from the airport, where do they go to now?
Well, there is an injunction out, which means that they're not allowed to cause trouble or cause disruption within the airport. Many of those behind me would have actually stayed here overnight, so it's not like they tried to come in throughout the daytime. But as I say, this isn't over. The momentum is not necessarily gone. We do know that about half an hour away from here, there is a pocket, maybe several hundred protesters outside a police station who are protesting. We know that there are large marches that are planned for the weekend, so this is by no means over. But we are seeing somewhat of a pullback from some protesters. They're apologising for what they see as what shouldn't have happened last night. As you say, there was someone who was believed to be an undercover undercover agent held by a certain group of protesters for many hours. They didn't allow paramedics to get to this individual who we understand lost consciousness at one point. There were some ugly scenes, and there are many protesters here today who have posters saying, "We apologize, this shouldn't have happened." So there does seem to be a little bit of reckoning, at least with some protesters today. Certainly there are other elements within this movement that will continue with violent tactics towards the police. But there are also a majority of protesters who are still being peaceful.
All right, we will stay on this story, no doubt. Good to have you on it for us. Paula Hancocks at Hong Kong's International Airport. Thanks so much. Police and protesters facing off on the streets of Hong Kong yet again. We're going to take you to live pictures now. You can see there it's just after 10:30 at night. Police in riot gear have been moving through the city, and protesters there are holding up signs and against those riot police. So you can see, we understand they have fired tear gas, and they have been holding up a sign right now. You can see it's being held up, warning tear smoke. That's what riot police do each time just before they fire tear gas. That's in order to try to disperse the crowds that have been gathering. Now, they started gathering a short time ago for what was meant to be a laser light vigil. That's what was happening when a skirmish started to take place. Now, you will remember that over the last 5 days, protesters have been staging a sit-in at the airport, and for the last 2 days, they brought the airport, the international airport in Hong Kong, one of the world's busiest, to a standstill. You can see their riot police now moving in on those protesters, about to fire tear gas yet again. Let's just listen to some of that sound. See a real show of force there. What looks to be hundreds of riot police with batons and helmets ready to fire tear gas. You can see also some onlookers, people on the streets there filming on their phones, trying to capture what is going on. These protests, of course, have been going for about 11 weeks. We are now in week 11 of these protests that have really affected the city. It's forced businesses to close. It's had a major impact on the economy there, and as I just mentioned, it meant the airport was forced to shut operations for the last 2 days, forcing thousands of flights to be cancelled. The airport is now up and running, and we know that there is an injunction, so protesters cannot gather at the airport. So we are trying to get some more reaction from China on all of this, which has been watching pretty closely as these protests have played out. I understand our Matt Rivers is with us now. Actually, we've got a filed piece from Matt Rivers. Let's play that.
Well, government officials here in Beijing forced to react yet again to another night of violent clashes between protesters and police, this time, of course, happening at the Hong Kong International Airport. The Hong Kong Affairs Office here in Beijing calling the actions of protesters inside that airport, quote, bordering on terrorism. And that kind of rhetoric, that increased rhetoric, in terms of negatively describing these protests, that's very much in line with what we've seen out of government officials here in Beijing recently, using much harsher language, both in official statements and also in state media, to describe these protests. State media kind of coalescing around this notion that these protests are being fomented by Western powers to incite what they would call a color revolution. That is certainly the negative message that is coming out of state media, choosing to ignore a lot of what protesters would say would be the very legitimate grievances that they have had, that has seen hundreds of thousands of people take to the streets peacefully in the vast majority of cases over the last 2 to 2+ months now. State media really coalescing and choosing to focus on images of violence, perhaps in order to shape the public narrative here in Beijing. And on Chinese social media, you know, there is a lot of anger over what happened in the airport. I think it's safe to say that the vast majority of sentiment in the mainland here, in terms of what we're seeing on social media, is unhappy with the protests that have been going on in Hong Kong, especially last night's actions in the airport. This, of course, leads us to the question, well, will the People's Liberation Army get involved? Could you at some point see Chinese troops on the streets of Hong Kong after the Hong Kong government asked them to come in. I don't think that we are there quite yet. That's generally the thought around most experts thinking on this subject, because think about what that would mean. That would essentially mean that China has admitted that its governance over Hong Kong has failed, that one country, two systems, the model in which Hong Kong has operated, has failed, that it would create a massive international response from not only Western governments, but bodies like the United Nations. Despite the fact that we've seen propaganda videos of Chinese troops on the border with Hong Kong, we've heard the President of the United States tweet about that very thing happening. The fact is that Chinese troops, it would cross a major line for Chinese troops to go into Hong Kong. I don't think we're there yet. However, things are continuing in Hong Kong. If violence increases, no one can really tell exactly where this is going to end up. Matt Rivers, CNN, Beijing.
We've got reporters on the case covering this story as it unfolds. We've got riot police on the streets. Ben Wedeman is amongst those people now, protesters returning to the streets the 11th week running. Ben, what are you seeing?
Okay, we're in Sham Shui Po, a very working-class neighborhood, where just about half an hour ago, there were protesters outside the local police station. The police responded very quickly, exiting the station and trying to disperse the protesters. Now, this is normally a very busy market, and in fact, it is now what is called the Festival of the Hungry Ghost. So many people are out. This is a festival where you pay homage to your ancestors, and according to local lore, this is the day when the gates of the netherworld are opened and the spirits of your ancestors come out. So normally lots of people are on the street, but it just so happens to coincide with this is the first time tear gas has been fired since the incidents at the airport yesterday. And it certainly appears that at the moment the situation is calm in this area. The police are further down this street, but it's significant that after yesterday's incidents at the airport, and we've seen today many of the protesters apologizing for the disruption and some of the bad behavior that we've seen at the airport. Nonetheless, it doesn't appear that that has made any difference to the people in this area who continue to carry out their protests and other actions outside the police station. And it appears that this is what we normally say an ongoing situation. Lynda?
It certainly is ongoing. Ben, just stand by for us. I just want to get to Paula Hancocks because we know that the airport there was effectively shut down the last 2 days, and officials there are doing everything they can to keep protesters out of the airport and keep it operating.
That's right, Lynda, yes. I mean, this is like a completely different airport today to last night. We have seen that there are officials at the entrance of the airport. They're checking that people have passports and boarding passes before they come in so that they know that they are actually passengers. They're not allowing protesters to come in. We do see some protesters behind me, some of them staying overnight. They're very peaceful. They're sitting quietly, and airport officials have not asked for them to be ejected at this point, but there's maybe a dozen or two. So it is a very different situation. You're also seeing more of a police presence within the airport, something you haven't seen over recent days, and that could well be to sort of try and allay any concerns that passengers could have as well. They're very visible, the police presence here. So it is a very different situation. There's an injunction that has been taken out against anybody who is going to cause disruption within the airport. The police have said there will be severe consequences against them, and this is not the place to protest. So as you can see, the protesters have taken their message elsewhere, as we saw from Ben's report. Lynda?
Thanks, Paula. Just stand by for us. I want to go back to Ben, who is on the streets where we are seeing those live pictures just after 10:30 at night. It appears he is talking to a protester. Ben, if you can hear me, if you can give us a sense of what the protesters are saying.
Have you taken part in the protests?
If you say from June, of course I've taken part in the anti-opposition protest, but not at all of them. But not tonight.
Not tonight, okay.
I just haven't been with my friends. I'm actually looking for desserts right now.
Okay.
So Ben, we just picked up probably halfway through that interview there with the protester. We just are hoping to get a sense of why the protesters are back on the streets tonight. Given this movement has no leader, how are they hoping to start this dialogue with China, with mainland China?
Okay, Lynda, well, let me pass on that question. What we're curious to know is that given that this protest movement doesn't really have any leaders, how are you going to get this message across to the Hong Kong government and the leadership in Beijing?
You mean the message of the protesters, or you mean what kind of message? A message
Yes.
of protesters? I think the message has been very clear that we have the 5 demands, and we don't need any leader to spread the message. The message is well said, and they have heard about it, but they don't listen to them. And I don't think there's any issue about the government not being able to listen to our message. It's just whether they act on the message.
Why do you think the government has not responded to your message, your 5 demands?
Because they don't care about the common people in Hong Kong. They don't give a damn about whether the streets are in chaos or not. They just care about they are still in power because they have the power. They have the votes in the parliament. That's what matters to them. And yeah, that's why they haven't responded. And I think the protesters are trying to get the message out again and again until they succumb to the people of Hong Kong.
Okay, thank you very much. Well, I think, Lynda, that pretty much sums it up. What many people feel is that the government has turned a deaf ear to these protests that are now in their 10th week, keeping in mind that they began on the 9th of June over the extradition bill. Carrie Lam, the chief executive, did in fact say that the bill is dead, although it hasn't officially been shelved. But beyond that, the other demands, which include the formation of an independent commission on police brutality, the release of protesters who are being held, universal suffrage, and the end of describing protesters as rioters. She has not given any ground on those demands, and she has made it clear several times in the last 10 days that she has no intention on budging on those demands. So essentially, we are at loggerheads here in Hong Kong with protesters who clearly aren't about to abate in their demands, and a government that isn't going to give ground on any of them. So we can expect this sort of situation where this was not a planned event, this was not a planned protest, but they could go on for the foreseeable future. Lynda?
Yeah, Ben, given that protester to you said he feels that China doesn't give a damn about them, it's hard to see where this is going to end, especially given there's no dialogue between the protesters and China, mainland China, that is. Ben Wedeman, on the streets of Hong Kong, we will continue to stay on this story. Thank you so much. I'm Lynda Kinkade. You have been watching those 2 breaking stories. Protests in Hong Kong, as well as that sharp drop on Wall Street. Stay with CNN. We've got the latest on both stories. World Sport is after a quick break.